All right, this week we are tackling chapter 10 in your textbook, which covers psychomotor stimulants. Psychomotor stimulants are a class of drugs, they comprise a class of drugs that stimulate transmission of neurotransmitters. You can see the neurotransmitters listed here: epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. These neurotransmitters are monoamines or biogenic amines. They're synthesized from a single amino acid. You can review that on page 85 of your textbook back in chapter 4. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine are all synthesized in the same pathway. They're catecholamines. Catechol is just the type of chemical, the name of the chemical, the chemical structure, the chemical family that they're part of. And then serotonin is an indolamine. Indole is another chemical family like catechols. So it's chemically different from the catecholamines, but similar enzymes destroy all of these, and they're all affected by these psychomotor stimulants. Sympathomimetic just means epinephrine is the major neurotransmitter for the sympathetic nervous system, which is the part of the nervous system that enacts fight or flight responses. So the term sympathomimetic can be used to refer to these drugs because it imitates, mimetic means it imitates the sympathetic nervous system. It kicks in those fight or flight responses. Stimulants can be synthesized or they can be found in nature as well. So the biggest class of synthetics that we're going to talk about are amphetamines. Adderall is D-L-amphetamine. It's a mixture of the D and L isomers. You don't have to worry about that. It's used to treat ADHD, and they can also be used for weight loss and dieting, and the book mentions narcolepsy. But the amphetamine that we've all heard about is methamphetamine. Meth is synthesized from ingredients that are fairly easy to get, such as cold medicine, but it's obviously very dangerous, it's obviously illegal, and you all know that this is a big problem in our country right now. And then there's naturally occurring stimulants as well. Cocaine comes from the coca bush. Cathinone or cat is similar to cocaine, but it's unstable, so it's not exported. And then ephedrine or ephedra comes from an herb. This is another weight loss medication. And then there's synthetics that are based on those naturally occurring drugs as well. So Ritalin, methylphenidate for ADHD, is very similar to cocaine. There's several synthetic derivatives based on cat that the book goes through. The amphetamines are weak bases. They're absorbed poorly from the digestive system. You'll recall that's a highly acidic environment. You can review that in chapter 1. With the amphetamines, their pKa's are between 9 and 10, so most of the drugs are ionized in the digestive system. So these drugs are more potent when they're administered by injection or inhalation. You bypass the digestive system that way. When the amphetamines are used medicinally, they're generally taken orally, and that way blood levels are constant for a longer time. But then when they're taken recreationally, you want to rush, so you inject and get quick high levels. Traditionally coca leaves were chewed along with something basic, lime or seashells, something like that. And that raises the pH of the saliva, so then it reduces the ionization of cocaine. Cocaine's pK is about 8.7. So that's traditionally chewed, but then obviously it's more common today to inject or sniff it, and again that would give improved absorption by bypassing the digestive system. It can also be smoked. Crack is cocaine hydrochloride with sodium bicarbonate or baking soda added to it, and this is the same idea as the traditional chewing with lime from wood ash or the seashells or whatever. Where the baking soda, improves the absorption because it keeps it from ionizing. And then similarly, cat can be chewed, that's the traditional way, but it can also be injected or sniffed. So the route of administration as always, affects the time to peak blood levels. Um, so with oral absorption, you're going to have peak in a matter of hours, maybe as quick as 30 minutes, the book says, but as long as 4 hours. And of course, that's going to be affected by the presence of food. And then if you administer something intranasally, it gives you a peak in 10 to 20 minutes. And then, as we've discussed before, an injection gives an effect almost immediately. These drugs can all cross the blood-brain barrier, and they end up being concentrated in the spleen, kidneys, and brain. And then metabolism and excretion of these drugs depends on the pH of the urine. So since these are generally weak bases, they don't reabsorb well into acidic urine, but with more basic urine, the drug can be reabsorbed. And in that case, when they're reabsorbed, they can be metabolized more by liver enzymes. And many of their metabolites are behaviorally active, especially for amphetamine, and have long half-lives. So amphetamine has a long half-life, 7 to 14 hours and up to 16 to 34 hours, again, depending on how well it's metabolized or how well it's excreted. And it can also be excreted in sweat and saliva. Cocaine is excreted much more quickly than amphetamines, with a half-life on the order of an hour or so, 40 to 75 minutes. And cathinone has a little bit longer than cocaine, but not much, half-life of about 90 minutes. So looking at those numbers, you see why meth lasts so much longer, gives such a longer rush than cocaine does. It has a lot longer effect because its half-life is so much longer compared to that of cocaine. Normally, monoamines are either degraded in the synapse or reabsorbed into the presynaptic cell by monoamine transporters, or MATs. And monoamines are then stored in vesicles by vesicular monoamine transporters, so those are VMATs. And the way that these drugs work is they mess with that process of removing the monoamine neurotransmitters from the synapse. So they can do that in one of two ways. Cocaine is an example of a reuptake inhibitor. And amphetamine, meth, is a releasing agent or a substrate type releaser. Reuptake inhibitors are more straightforward to explain, so I'm going to go through that first. Ritalin's another example of this. It basically, what happens here is it binds the receptor site of the monoamine transporter, so that neurotransmitter, the monoamine, cannot get back into the presynaptic neuron. The monoamine then remains in the synaptic cleft for longer than it should and at higher concentrations than normal, and so it has more of an effect than it would have otherwise if it had been removed right away. Now, releasing agents or substrate type releasers like meth look like the neurotransmitter. So they're able to use the monoamine transporters to get into the presynaptic cell, where first of all they're competing with the monoamine to bind the transporter. Second, once they're in, they're competing with the monoamine to bind the vesicular monoamine transporter to get into the vesicles. Then, once they get into the vesicles, they're disrupting the pH of the vesicles, which causes the vesicles to release the monoamines into the cytoplasm. They also mess up the transporters, so the transporters sometimes act in reverse, pumping the monoamines out, and they sometimes are just open. They sometimes just let things flow through willy-nilly, however they need to go based on their by diffusion, basically, based on their concentration gradients. The substrate type releasers also inhibit MAO, and this is a review from an earlier chapter, but basically the idea is that when the neurotransmitters are just floating around free in the cytoplasm, normally they're degraded by enzymes, and these drugs inhibit those enzymes that degrade their neurotransmitters. And then a final point is that autoreceptors normally inhibit the release of neurotransmitters when high concentrations are already outside the cell. That doesn't work for substrate releasers. It does modulate the effect of reuptake inhibitors like cocaine, because when the autoreceptors can sense that there's already plenty of neurotransmitters outside the cell in the synapse, it won't allow release of further neurotransmitter. So all of this, basically amphetamines and other releasing agents or substrate type releasers, act in a lot of different ways. And I've got figure 10-1 on the next slide, so we'll go through that one more time. In the sympathetic nervous system, when this is stimulated in the peripheral nervous system, it's basically a fight or flight response. And then beyond acting as a stimulant, cocaine can also block sodium channels in membranes, blocking the action potentials going through that neuron, being fired in that neuron. So it can be an anesthetic. And synthetic anesthetics have been developed for that purpose now. We don't still use cocaine to numb, your gums or whatever for dentistry. But you do see that the drugs that are used for that end in cane, like Novocaine, because that's what it was initially based on. So here's figure 10-1, and in panel A, you see what happens normally. The little blue balls here are dopamine, but you can imagine any monoamine here. You can imagine epinephrine or norepinephrine or serotonin. So you see the green guys, the little receptors, are dopamine transporters. They bring dopamine back into the cell, back into the presynaptic cell. The blue receptors, dopamine receptors on the postsynaptic cell, sense the dopamine in the synapse, and that's what causes, or that's what dictates action potential firing in that postsynaptic cell. Back in the presynaptic cell, you see the synaptic vesicles, where there's only one of them, so synaptic vesicle, where the dopamine is stored when it's inside the presynaptic cell. So right now you see some floating around in the cytoplasm, but that green one, the vesicular monoamine transporter, is working to put the dopamine back into the synaptic vesicle, right? Okay, so then in panel B, so panel A is what happens normally. Panel B is with cocaine around. And pardon the drawing here, but cocaine is the square that's blocking the dopamine transporter on the presynaptic cell. So everything else is the same. Inside the presynaptic cell, you've still got the synaptic vesicle with the dopamine in there. But since those squares, that cocaine is blocking transport of the dopamine back into the presynaptic cell, more dopamine is stuck outside in the synapse. So then it's having more of an effect on that postsynaptic cell. The cocaine is a reuptake inhibitor. It's inhibiting the reuptake of cocaine from the synapse back into the presynaptic cell. That's labeled MAT blockade. It's blocking the monoamine transporter. Now, C is where things get crazy. This is your brain on meth. So meth is a substrate type releaser again, and there's a lot of different things going on here. So first you see the idea is that you can kind of see the triangles are interacting with the dopamine transporters, and as well as the VMAT, the one at the vesicle. So the meth is getting into the presynaptic cell as well as into the synaptic vesicle. Once it's in there, it's messing with the transporters and it's messing with the pH of the vesicles. So now those transporters are working in reverse. The transporters are pumping or just open. They're either pumping the neurotransmitter out of the vesicle and out of the presynaptic cell. They're also sometimes just open and allowing the neurotransmitter to flow whichever direction in its concentration gradient. So then you see a ton of the the neurotransmitter out in the synapse. Compare the it's not scientific by any means, but if you compare the amount of dopamine in the synapse from A to B, you see it went up quite a bit. If you compare it from A to C, you can see that there's a lot more of it even. Now there's just a ton of it floating out there in the synapse, and the postsynaptic cell is going to just be constantly stimulated. Psychomotor stimulants' effects on the body are due to their effect on the sympathetic nervous system, again, that fight or flight response. So they cause an increase in heart rate, increased blood pressure. Vasodilation is dilation of blood vessels to get more blood to your muscles so you can run away from whatever. And bronchodilation is opening up the bronchial tubes in your lungs, so again, you can run away from whatever it is the fight or flight response is in response to. Then they also have effects on sleep. They prevent sleep or can cause insomnia, and that's a big reason of why they're used. People who need to stay awake for long periods of time. Stimulants have a number of effects on human behavior and performance. First, there's subjective effects, and you can see some of these results charted in Figure 10-2, where people just experience an improved mood, they're more talkative and friendly, they're high-spirited, bubbly, they have a sense of well-being or exhilaration. People also have a euphoric rush, being lifted up and extremely happy, and then 20 to 30 minutes later, a depressive feeling where they have a crash. There's also an increase in stereotype behaviors. These are useless, repetitive behaviors, also called punding, where people might take things apart and put them back together, or sort through their handbag and put it back together. Compulsive, useless cleaning, those types of behaviors. Monoamine psychosis is another negative effect at high doses and with repeated use. It's indistinguishable from paranoid schizophrenia, and people also commonly report formication, feeling bugs or snakes or something like that crawling on their skin. And then for some people, it might cause violent behavior. This may be due to the increased sympathetic response. Some people fight in the fight or flight response, and that violence can be sudden and unpredictable. Then sensory effects, there seems to be an increase in visual acuity and improvements in the auditory flicker fusion, so more sensitive vision and hearing. And then people underestimate the passage of time. They feel they're sped up, they're on speed, they're going faster, so it seems like other things are going slower. And then effects on performance, again, because of the stimulant effects here, it decreases fatigue, causes a faster reaction time and better short-term memory. It improves vigilance and attention, which is why it's used to treat ADHD, but it increases the focus. People report tunnel vision, so it's not helpful when you need to multitask. And somewhat counterintuitive, it has negative effects on driving. It increases the risk of being killed in a car crash to 2.3 times higher. You might think it would improve driving because it would make you more focused and more better reaction times, that kind of thing. But in fact, people go at higher speeds and they weave out of lanes, they drift out of their lanes, somewhat erratic driving. And that might be due to needing to take in lots of information when you're driving, the tunnel vision problem that we just discussed. And then finally, athletic performance. Remember the vasodilation and bronchodilation, so people can go faster. And so because of that, these drugs are banned by most sports federations. It's illegal to use them in competition. Animals, non-humans, have unconditioned as well as conditioned behavior effects due to taking psychomotor stimulants. At low doses, rats showed increased motor activity with amphetamines, but monkeys actually decreased their motor activity. And at higher doses, they start out with increased motor activity, and then after a while they show more stereotype behavior. So stereotype behaviors in rodents are things like head bobbing or sniffing, gnawing and biting. And then it gets more complex in monkeys. Their stereotype behavior is things like examining their hands or moving sideways. And interestingly, the same animal shows the same stereotype behaviors if they are tested again at different dates. And then, of course, stereotype behaviors in humans is also more complex with the sorting and resorting or the cleaning or something like that. With high doses, it's common for animals to chew on their bodies. This is called automutilation. This might be stereotype behavior, or it might be formication, where they think they feel bugs crawling on their skin and they're trying to get that off. And then the major takeaway point with conditioned behavior is the rate dependency effect. The relationship between the effect of amphetamines and the rate of responding is dependent on the behavior itself. So it might be stimulated or depressed depending on if a response is normally slow, it'll increase that response, but if a response is normally fast, it can decrease it. So the effect of the drug depends on the baseline behavior and the rate of that baseline behavior. So just a few words on dissociation and discrimination. Amphetamines do cause dissociation, so training under the influence is not necessarily remembered when a subject is not under the influence. That's been demonstrated with rats, and the book says that it might extend to humans as well. So using amphetamines to study might not translate to a better test score the next day or whatever. Discrimination, rats can discriminate amphetamines and cocaine from saline, and in rats that can be blocked by blocking dopamine receptors in the mesolimbic dopamine system. So dopamine is contributing to the discrimination process. Then humans can also discriminate amphetamines from placebos, and you can see some of those results of a study showing that in figure 10-3. The percent who were responding in a drug appropriate way given those different doses. But the methamphetamine response was generalized, so humans could not distinguish between methamphetamine, D-amphetamine, and methylphenidate. So acute tolerance can develop to these drugs, and it's with cocaine. The slang for acute tolerance is called a coke out, where a person, if they sniff it repeatedly over a period of a day, 12 hours or whatever, cocaine loses its ability to improve their mood, and they become tolerant to subjective effects. This resolves pretty quickly. It can be gone within 24 hours, but importantly, this does not include non-subjective effects, so blood pressure, heart rate, effects like that are not affected. So eventually you get to where the person's just trying to get to normal. It's not really helping with the crashes at all, so it ends their run. But if they continue to bump up their dose, trying to chase those subjective effects still, it can cause problems because, again, the tolerance does not develop to acute tolerance does not develop to the non-subjective effects. Chronic tolerance, again, is where you become tolerant with repeated administration. The appetite suppressant effect disappears after a few weeks of use. The rapid heartbeat and raised blood pressure can also go away. So this is where those effects do develop tolerance over repeated use with chronic tolerance. Lethal effects can also develop tolerance. So people who are frequent or high users, they can increase their dose to extremely high levels and survive that. And then a few effects are actually sensitized. They show reverse tolerance. Stereotype behaviors typically increase with repeated use, and psychotic symptoms also tend to increase with use. After a single administration of cocaine or amphetamine, a person experiences a crash. with symptoms such as depression and lethargy. The opponent process theory would predict the opposite of the effects of the drug is what you would experience after the drug has worked its way out of your system. And that crash happens within half an hour for cocaine, but it takes a little bit longer for amphetamines. And then with longer term use, when these drugs are stopped, you can go through withdrawal. Now, withdrawal from stimulants is not associated with a severe, it's not associated with needing to be medically monitored. These symptoms are not likely to be life-threatening, they're just unpleasant. So it's mainly depression and symptoms of depression. And again, with opponent process theory, since these drugs are uppers, they give you a euphoric positive experience. The withdrawal from these are the opposite types of symptoms. So people experience withdrawal within 24 hours with symptoms including depression, compensatory increase in eating and sleeping, lethargy, vivid or unpleasant dreams. Now, some people have insomnia rather than lethargy, and people might be quite agitated, but your psychomotor can also be slowed down. Depression can escalate to suicidal thoughts, especially at high doses. If the drug had been used for a long time or at high doses, then withdrawal symptoms will typically be more severe. With this withdrawal, the initial phase is about 1 week, but some symptoms, especially the sleep and the dreams disruptions, can continue for weeks to months. And then there's also performance deficits associated with with stopping these drugs. And so the book talked about people making decisions, their decision-making skills being dysfunctional on different tasks, and that those deficits lasting up to a year after stopping the drug. Cocaine is most often used socially, which means that people use it occasionally, sporadically, and you can describe the typical use as a run abstinence cycle where people take large quantities over a short time, so that's called a run, and then they abstain for a period of time. And then cocaine's often taken with other drugs. The book talks about a speedball. If cocaine's taken with heroin, it tends to reduce the jitteriness of cocaine, and then cocaine diminishes the sleepiness that comes with heroin, so they kind of cancel out some of the unwanted effects of each other. Amphetamines also are typically used sporadically with a run abstinence cycle. The book describes the peak user or speed freak, which are terms describing when people inject amphetamines every few hours until they either run out of drugs or run out of money or just become exhausted. And that type of heavy use often leads to paranoia and punding behaviors, and then when they crash, they can sleep for several days, 24 to 48 hours. Then in figure 10-5, you can see a graph of use of cocaine and amphetamines among 19 to 28-year-olds in the United States over the past few decades. So you see the use of these drugs was pretty widespread in the 80s, and it decreased to about 5% in the mid-90s. There was a slight resurgence in the mid-2000s, and cocaine use has since dropped, but amphetamine use is still rising. Laboratory animals will self-administer cocaine, and it's kind of interesting that morphine was the first drug to be shown that animals would self-administer, but cocaine was the second drug to show that. And it was also some evidence that drugs were reinforcing beyond relieving withdrawal symptoms. Figure 10-6 goes through or shows how monkeys self-administer cocaine in an erratic pattern. This is when the cocaine is freely available. It'll administer enough to give itself convulsions within a few weeks, and you can also see a run abstinence cycle where the monkey stopped responding for a day before resuming use.
And they've shown that laboratory animals will give themselves cocaine enough to overdose, to kill themselves. Now, if they restrict access, the animals won't take as much, so the animals can be much more self-regulating. And this is true of other psychomotor stimulants too, with various routes of administration. And then box 10-2 talks about a progressive ratio schedule of drug administration to find a breaking point where it's too much work for an animal to get the drug. And you can increase that break point if a rat's exposed to cocaine ahead of time and with a week or so of abstinence in between. And then that box goes through how the availability of the drug, the dose of the drug, and other factors that affect how the break point can increase, what basically different ways that the drug can become more motivating to an animal. So take a look at that box, it's pretty interesting. When Ritalin is given to treat hyperactivity in children, it can cause a reduction in their growth. Cocaine can cause jaundice, the yellowing of the skin due to liver disease. It can also cause inflammation and ulceration of the mucous membranes in the nose, and it's expensive, so it can cause personal financial problems. Amphetamines, when they're used on a short-term basis, can cause restlessness, confusion, dizziness. When they're used more chronically, they can cause paranoid psychotic behavior, punding, and irrational thinking. And the psychotic behavior is at least somewhat due to lack of sleep, since these drugs can keep you awake for a long time. Lack of sleep is known in and of itself in otherwise healthy people to be able to cause irrational thinking and hallucinations and problems like that. Amphetamines can cause increased blood pressure, which can lead to stroke. And the book also talks about damage to the heart from amphetamines. And then as use is stopped, we've already talked about the depression, suicidality, the lethargy, and the sleep disturbances that occur. Amphetamines can also cause irreversible brain damage and can be neurotoxic to the brain, damaging the dopamine neurons and causing cell death from as few as 4 administrations. There are also indirect effects that can be harmful due to the use of these drugs, and they're related to lifestyle choices that users make, particularly using dirty needles or needles that haven't been sterilized properly. And that puts you at risk of diseases such as hepatitis and AIDS. And then the appetite suppressing effects make a person's diet very poor. With poor sleep, there's just a lot of general health issues, and that decreases a person's ability to fight off diseases as well. Then the effects of the effects of the drugs, it can make a person more prone to violence. And people using these drugs are 6 times more likely to die than the general population, with the highest death rate being in people using the drugs intravenously and with psychiatric symptoms as well. And then these drugs can be used to enhance sexual activity because of the euphoria they cause. People might choose more high-risk partners or high-risk practices that increase the risk of contracting diseases. However, chronic use can lead to a disruption in sexual function. And then there are also problems in children born to mothers who use stimulants. There's a stereotype in place about crack babies, but that's somewhat of an exaggeration. There is a statistically significant effect of crack in being used by the mother causing slower fetal growth, and babies are then more likely to be premature. They are also much more likely to have placental abruption, where the placenta detaches from the uterine wall prematurely, and that can lead to premature birth.
but crack has not been shown to reduce a child's intelligence. There have been links established between um, stimulant use and focus, aggression, and irritability. So, with large doses of cocaine, people commonly experience muscle weakness and respiratory depression, and the lethality of the drug depends on the route of administration. So there's some variance from person to person, depending on a person's gender and weight and those types of things that we've talked about before. Um, so the book gives a median lethal dose of cocaine for a 150-pound man at about 500 megs. Of course, a chronic tolerance would increase that number. But if snorted, the median lethal dose, the LD50, can be about 30 megs, so that's less than 1/10 of the 500 meg number. And that's just because it's absorbed so much more quickly, and the blood levels, it's really not about the dose that's taken, but the blood levels and the brain levels of drug. If the brain just gets flooded with the drug, the lethal effects can take place at much lower doses. With an overdose, the cocaine reaction has first an initial excitement, but then severe headache, nausea, vomiting, and seizures, convulsions. And that's followed by loss of consciousness, respiratory depression, and cardiac failure, which can result in death. And that can be as quick as a few minutes. It can take up to half an hour. Once you get past a few hours after the dose was taken, you're probably clear of lethal effects, but the effects of oxygen not being delivered to your body tissues can cause permanent damage, especially brain damage. So if a person shows up in the ER, there are some medications that can be used to treat an overdose: diazepam, chlorpromazine, as well as artificial respiration to help counteract the effects of the depressed respiration. Now, finally, treatments for people who are using stimulants. First and foremost, there's behavioral therapies. So cognitive behavioral therapy is where a person tries to restructure their thoughts and recognize when they're having irrational thoughts and then replace those with more rational ones. The idea that I need the drug to survive. People, they might not have that thought outright, but they might identify when they're having those urges, and they can think through how they don't really need it, and they can employ coping strategies and challenge themselves in how they're thinking about the drug. Contingency management uses operant conditioning to give people rewards for continued abstinence, and then community reinforcement is getting a person's family and social connections, their friends, to give positive feedback and praise for their continued abstinence. Those techniques can be combined, and they're often more effective that way. And then pharmacotherapies can also be used either to control cravings or reduce abuse potential, and these are most often used in conjunction with behavioral therapies, not alone. Modafinil stimulates the transmission of dopamine, norepinephrine, and glutamate and releases histamine. It's used to treat ADHD and narcolepsy with a relatively low abuse potential. However, its use in people addicted to cocaine and amphetamines has been inconclusive. So some studies say it works, some studies show that it doesn't, or what have you. And bupropion is the generic name of Wellbutrin. It's an antidepressant. It can also be used as a smoking cessation aid. It can also be used to help you stop smoking. It's effective in light users to reduce craving, but it doesn't work as well for heavy users. So it blocks dopamine transporter and norepinephrine transporters. Remember, those are the proteins that bring the neurotransmitters back into the presynaptic neuron from the synapse. So it works a lot like these drugs do, but and in that way it helps reduce cravings for the drug. Methylphenidate is the generic name for Ritalin, and again, it's cocaine-like. It blocks dopamine transporter, neuropinephrine transporter, but it has less abuse potential than cocaine and amphetamines. So this is effective in heavy IV amphetamine users. Oral D-amphetamine is an effective maintenance therapy for amphetamine and cocaine users. So as an oral drug, it's less dangerous than an intravenous drug because you're not getting the huge blood level changes you get with IV administration. And it's also less addicting because, again, you're not getting that initial rush of the drug levels. Naltrexone is an opioid antagonist, so the endogenous opioid system is involved with reinforcement. We'll talk about that a lot more in a little bit, next week or the week after. So this opioid antagonist blocks some of those effects, things like subjective effects from the drugs, craving, and this has been shown that it can control amphetamine usage. It can reduce amphetamine usage. Then the last point is immunization. Research is underway to make a vaccine for these drugs, for cocaine. Um, there's a lot of different problems, technical problems with getting your body to make enough antibodies to the drug and then having them stick around for more than a few months. But it's a pretty neat idea if you think about being able to be immunized against cocaine or amphetamines or something like that.